Welcome everyone to a very special ESS lecture this evening. My name is Deborah Ross. I'm the Manager of Outreach and Communications at the College of Sustainability. It's great to see you all here, and welcome to everyone online. It's an honor for us to co-sponsor this event each year in honor of a dear friend of the college and Dalhousie colleague, Meinhard Doelle. We are still in the last week of Mi'kmaq History Month in Nova Scotia, a chance for us to celebrate Mi'kmaq culture, language, and traditions, and to deepen our understanding of the history of the Mi'kmaq as the original people of Mi'kma'ki and here in Shubuktux. I'd also like to acknowledge the African Nova Scotian community who have shared these lands for over 400 years. So a warm welcome. And finally, I'd like to introduce Dean Sarah Harding of the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie.
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to see you all here. This isn't my home turf, given that I'm here in the business school as opposed to not in the law school. But I nonetheless want to welcome you all here to the conversation and to the lecture this evening. And in particular, I want to say a warm welcome to Meinhard's family. I see Wendy and the Doelle family over there, so really lovely to see you again. The real introductions will follow. The introductions of this lecture series, of Meinhard's work, and of our speaker tonight. But I do want to take this opportunity to just add a few thoughts of my own. Most of you probably won't know that Meinhard and I actually went to law school together. We graduated together in 1989, and all the way back then, he was already incredibly passionate about environmental law and policy. And that was at a time when there weren't a whole lot of people who were incredibly passionate within law schools in that field. So he was very much a path breaker at that time. I left the country after we graduated from law school, so I never had the opportunity to be Meinhard's colleague. But I did see his work from afar. I always knew what he was doing and was consistently impressed by his work and the impact he had in environmental law and policy, in climate change, in work on decarbonization, and the whole array of topics that he focused on, environmental assessments. I know that Sarah Seck will say a few more words about some of his impact as a scholar. But he also had an impact as a teacher. And I learned about that impact from the alumni I've met over the years. The last couple of years I've been dean. I've heard a lot of marvelous things about his impact on them as students and how difficult it was for them to lose him at such an early or young age. For me, it's always a really special thing to come and say a few words at the beginning of this lecture. Sarah asks me every year, and I jump at the chance. I say, of course. I find it has a very special connection for me, and always very happy to say a few words. And with that, I will pass the microphone on to Sarah. Oh, I do want to say one more thing, but keep coming up. I also think it's particularly special that this evening, we have Adebayo, who is one of Meinhard's students. So it's a very touching, very special, very full circle kind of moment to have him here as our speaker for the evening. Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. So my name is Sarah Seck, and I am the current director of the Marine and Environmental Law Institute and a professor here at the Schulich School of Law. And I was also a close colleague of Meinhard's over a number of years. When I first started venturing into the teaching of environmental law, the first book that I used and still use is an edited casebook that Meinhard dedicated a lot of his life to developing. He published extensively books on impact assessment, an early book on climate change and international environmental law, and I had the pleasure of co-editing a book with him on climate change loss and damage, which we completed shortly before he passed away. I also had the pleasure of co-supervising and engaging with him in graduate supervision, and Professor Majekolagbe, who is now on faculty at the University of Alberta's Faculty of Law, was one of those graduate students that we co-supervised. Meinhard made great contributions to teaching at the law school, but was also very active at the College of Sustainability, so contributed widely in teaching in every capacity imaginable, working on government policy, and just someone we miss greatly. However, we are delighted to have the opportunity to welcome back people who had studied with Meinhard, and this includes Professor Adebayo Majekolagbe. And I'm going to keep calling him Professor Majekolagbe because even though he's graduated and is a professor, he insists on writing emails to me where he says, "Hi, Prof." So this is revenge. Professor Majekolagbe is an assistant professor of law at the Faculty of Law, University of Alberta. He previously served as an adjunct professor while a graduate student here at the Schulich School of Law, and has taught for us climate law, among other things, and has taught climate law also at the University of Alberta, where he also teaches other courses like constitutional law, international business transactions, and other things. His Ph.D. thesis was actually the one that won a Dalhousie gold medal. I think they're called the gold medal. The best doctoral thesis in the social sciences. It focused on just transition and impact assessment in the context of climate change, which is something that will have influenced the talk he's going to give tonight. And this research was also featured in a showcase on Parliament Hill. Professor Majekolagbe also had the opportunity to co-author a number of papers with Meinhard, which I think is also special. And with that, I welcome you to give the lecture of the evening on the potential or the problem of illegitimacy in climate law. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. I forgot to include in the bio that I was once a teaching assistant at the College of Sustainability. I was a TA in global environmental governance. Yes. Yeah, so I've been around. So it's an immense honor to be delivering today's lecture. My gratitude to Miller, the College of Sustainability, for this platform and my invitation. Thank you, Professor Sack, Prof. It's great to be here. A very special thanks to the Doelle family. Wendy, Alida, Nicola, we just met close to the waterfront. It was fun, though not planned. Cam, Tom, Clara, Nadia. Wendy and Meinhard very kindly opened up their home to a very broke PhD student in 2019-2020. And they allowed me to stay at their place at below market rates, while she and Meinhard were away in Sweden. So thanks, Wendy. I hope I didn't break anything. In 2016, when I was practicing law in Nigeria, I began to consider applying for grad studies here in Canada. I came across one of Meinhard's videos on the 2015 Paris Agreement, and I reached out to him that morning. I applied, no, I reached out to him and I left for court that day. But by midday, Meinhard had responded expressing interest in my work. Now I receive quite a number of similar emails from students across the world who want to pursue grad studies. And I remember the speed with which Meinhard responded to me, and that is a judgment because I've not been able to match that. Meinhard and I, we were very different. We had different soccer teams. I support Chelsea. Is there any Chelsea fan here? Yeah, oh, come on. I support Chelsea in the English Premier League. Meinhard supported Borussia Dortmund in the German Bundesliga. Another difference, I support Edmonton Oilers. We play tonight. Meinhard certainly didn't support Edmonton Oilers. And Meinhard had this very trademark eyebrow waggle whenever something mischievous happened. I don't have that waggle, like he goes. But more importantly, Meinhard and I, we differed in our emphasis on climate change law. Meinhard emphasized effective policies. He wants effective climate policies, policies that work. I emphasized equitable climate policies, justice, just transition. But over time, after 5 years, we converged. We realized that for climate laws to be effective, they must be equitable. And that ineffective climate policies will eventually be inequitable to present and future generations. And this convergence informed a work we did together in 2022, which was then published in 2023, and I quote a part of what we wrote in that work. Meaningful participation is particularly relevant to the integration of climate change into impact assessment, as it is a site for respect and recognition of rights and interests, transformative learning for all stakeholders, collective and cooperative action, legitimacy of interventions, and adaptive management. Central to that 2023 publication was the problem and is the problem of illegitimacy in climate laws, an issue I will explore today. What I will do is I will give an overview of the current state of climate change and climate laws in Canada and globally. I will introduce a conceptual framework. How do you think about illegitimacy? And what do we do about that? Earlier this month, I had a community engagement event in rural Alberta. I will draw anecdotal lessons from that community engagement on how to think about the issues of legitimacy and dealing with the problems of illegitimacy. So in January of 2025, the world witnessed the warmest January on record. It was 1.75 degrees, higher than what it should normally have been. And the last 3 years, 2023 to 2025, have been the hottest on record. I know because I now have an air conditioner in my house. I shouldn't need that in Edmonton. But 1.75, I hate the stuff. Like 1.5 degrees Celsius, what does that even mean? the world should aim for 1.5 degrees Celsius, average, blah, blah. What does that mean? It is more than a number. It means a drier climate. It means more severe drought and food insecurity in Africa. It means real people losing their history and their homes. It means very serious and severe hurricane like Hurricane Melissa, almost still ongoing in the Caribbean. Multiple countries affected. It means real people losing culture and history. It is more than a number. It means life-threatening heat waves in Africa. How about here in Canada? 1.5 degrees Celsius or more. What does that mean for us? It means more destructive and uncontrollable wildfire seasons. And you've experienced it here in Nova Scotia. It means melting permafrost in northern Canada. Catastrophic flooding here in the Atlantic. It means droughts in the prairie. It is more than a number. Serious life-changing consequences from climate change. But if it's that serious, shouldn't we be treating it very seriously? But we literally continue to add fuel to the fire. Rather than meaningfully reducing the human causes of climate change, the world is doubling down. The projected and planned fossil fuel production till 2030 is 120%. 120% more than would or will be conducive or suitable for a safe world. 120% more plant production. And global coal demand, there was a time we thought global coal demand was in decline and people aren't using coal anymore. But 2024, 2025, and it's projected that in 2026, the demand for coal would be the highest on record. Like, what are we doing? After the 2015 Paris Agreement, there was this movement to enact climate legislation, climate laws. And this platform shows almost 2,000 climate laws that have been enacted between 2018 and 2025. That's a lot of laws, right? A lot of laws. But what this suggests is that action is being taken to deal with climate change. In the last few years, however, what we have witnessed is a worldwide reversal and watering down and neutering of climate laws. So, for example, European Union leaders are now including a revision clause in their climate commitment, which would allow them the flexibility to review their climate targets for reasons including competitiveness. Another example, after a decade of negotiation, countries have failed to approved the International Maritime Organization Net Zero Framework. And that would have helped us reduce emissions from shipping. And if you're still not convinced, a while ago, Mark Carney led the creation of what was called the Net Zero Banking Alliance, and this year, that was shut down. Do you need another one? How about 48 hours ago, Bill Gates published an article basically saying, let us prioritize economic growth over climate change. There is a reversal in the little progress that the number of laws that have been made over the years would have indicated. There is a global backsliding. How about in Canada? In Canada, and you would see that I used Canada the Moonwalking Laggard. If you are familiar with Michael Jackson, I thought I should use a picture of Michael Jackson moonwalking so you would have gotten the idea better. Typically, we've not done well in Canada as regards climate change. But even the little we've done, we are reversing. Carbon tax, gone. The zero vehicle mandate, as good as gone. Pipelines, making a comeback. And just recently, the Carney government said, well, we don't believe in climate objectives anymore. We just want to emphasize competitiveness now. We are backsliding. In Canada, so what we've seen in Canada and other places in the world is that we are in an era of retrenchment. What I started with was that I showed you how important this subject is. It is consequential. It is life-changing. I've shown you laws that appear from 2015 to date. It appeared to show that we were doing something about it. But I've now shown you multiple proofs of how across the world we are drawing back and backsliding. So the question you should ask yourself is why? And explanations you get for the question why range from Donald Trump and his anti-climate policies. Or you would hear the global far right. Or Russia's attack on Ukraine. That's the reason there is backsliding in climate actions. Or China's economic influence and we need to compete with China. That is a good enough reason to draw back on meaningful climate action. But I would agree that probably there is a sense in which those explanations perhaps play a role. But I think the more accurate narrative, I would argue, is simple. We don't need to overcomplicate things. Governments reverse policies that are not accepted or policies that are perceived as not accepted by the public, as they do not want to risk their hold on power. Government reverse policies that are not accepted or perceived as not accepted by the public because they do not want to risk their hold on power. This is the problem of illegitimacy, and that's what I'm speaking to today. And I want you to pay attention to two concepts. I know I have quite a number of students in the audience. And on another day, I would have jumped into the crowd to engage with you. But allow me to be professorial. I want you to think of two concepts, legality and legitimacy. And the point is that legality is not legitimacy. Law, just as law, is not the answer to climate change. Shocker. The Supreme Court of Canada in the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act reference provided a useful articulation of the unique features of climate change. The Supreme Court mentioned three things. One, climate change has no boundary. Emissions have no boundary. Number two, the effects of climate change are not directly linked to the sources of GHG emissions. Number three, no province, territory, or country can address climate change on its own. Okay? In sum, if you can't remember the 3 points, the Supreme Court said climate change is a global crisis. The global nature of climate change compels, and I think I went ahead of myself there. That's a fun one, but I will come back to that. The global nature of climate change compels a global response. And I don't know how familiar you are with climate change. We've had the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We've had the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. We've had the 2015 Paris Agreement. All these conventions, international agreements, then inform our national laws like the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act or the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, or it informs provincial laws. So you've got these international conventions that shape domestic legislation. However, framing climate change as a global issue and approaching climate change or climate lawmaking from its global perspective might be one of the most overlooked yet crucial limitations of effectively addressing climate change. I would repeat that. Framing climate change as a primarily global problem might be one of the most serious, consequential limitations of effective climate governance. Climate change is at once a global problem and a local reality. It requires that we make radical choices, far-reaching changes in the most basic areas of life. It requires that we rethink the food we eat, how we eat, the cars we drive, our transportation, the way we build our houses. It requires that I consider, should I do this on Zoom or should I travel? It affects us at the most basic level. You don't legislate such a far-reaching local level phenomenon from such a high level. You don't engage such a matter almost entirely as a global top-down concern. Put simply, and I will try to make this very simple, until we put the local at the center of climate lawmaking, the problem of illegitimacy will remain and perhaps worsen. So laws, Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, the Supreme Court in 2020 or 2021 affirmed the legality of the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, but that law never attained legitimacy. So a couple of years after the Supreme Court affirmed the legality, a government had to come and gutted a central piece of that legislation because it didn't attain legitimacy. Legitimacy, not legality, guarantees the durability and long-term effectiveness of law. Legitimacy, not legality, guarantees the durability and long-term effectiveness of law. In my class, at this point, I will stop and say, did you get it? Do you understand? But I won't do that with you, okay? Let's move on. Let's talk about the problem of legitimacy. These were the best pictures I could get, okay? So, in 1998, and are there lost students here? Any law students? Yay! Constitutional law is fun, right? And you love the succession reference. Yes. I won't tell your prof. So the Supreme Court in 1998 engaged with various questions in a case called the succession reference. And what that is done for often, unwritten constitutional principles, but that's not what I'm talking about. There were parts of that decision where the Supreme Court gave us the definition or some of the main features of legitimacy. The Supreme Court said that beyond the need for adherence to the rule of law, legality, the Canadian political system must be capable of reflecting the aspirations of the people. And that the political system must allow for the participation and accountability of the people. In other words, the court said participation, if you're taking notes, I wonder if you will be examined on this, because I can see like very serious note takers. Wow. Students in my school, sorry, I'm just a very, this is a formal setting, so let me go back to type. So participation, accountability, and a system aligned with the aspirations of the people, those are the features of legitimacy, according to the Supreme Court in the succession reference. The first Indian national to become an American law professor, Sawyer Prakash Sinha, made the point that legitimacy, the legitimacy of a legal order, is dependent upon how well that order accommodates the demands of liberty, community, and social justice, rather than helplessly succumbing to the police power of the state. The flip side is true. Illegitimate legal orders do not accommodate or seem not to accommodate the demands of liberty, community, and social justice. Such legal orders are bedeviled by one or more of the following, and I tried to use these pictures to depict these three things. A single order, a single value approach, normative monopoly, and the presumption of perfect communication. I call these three things the indicia or the indicators of illegitimacy. A single value approach, normative monopoly, and the presumption of perfect communication. The common denominator of those three indicia is what a legal theorist and sociologist, John Griffith, referred to as the neglect of the shop floor of social life. In these three things, you find the neglect of the shop floor of social life. Griffith argued that the social working operation or even acceptance of law depends upon the mobilization of legal rules on the shop floor of social life. In the context of law, legal theorists have described something similar in the context of the expressive function of the law. So let's return to the three indicia of illegitimacy. And I will speak to the three indicia, or if you like, I used ChatGPT for this. Don't write a paper with it, but it's good for this. So let's speak about what these three things are about. At the heart of the single value approach is the assumption of the right answer. It assumes that conflicting and diverse values and interests can be justified under one truth. And diversity can be reduced into one approach. Instead of being subjected to multiple assessments and judgments considering their contextual factors. Climate change is a global issue, but its impact and perceptions of measures to address it are shaped by distinct local realities. A single value approach conflicts with this feature of climate change. In Canada, as in many other jurisdictions, for example, carbon pricing is essentialized as the quintessential climate policy. And I would have referred you, and I won't trouble you with this, with the story of how we came to have the GGPPA, the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. It began in 2016. I said I won't bore you with it, but I will. It began in 2016 with the Vancouver Declaration. The Vancouver Declaration, every province in Canada with the federal government signed up to that. And the Vancouver Declaration had a lot of climate measures in it, including carbon pricing. Then fast forward to the Vancouver Declaration becoming the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. At that point, carbon pricing was made the essential, most important subset or most important measure in the Pan-Canadian Framework. So in the Vancouver Declaration, we had many measures. In the Pan-Canadian Framework, we had other measures, except that carbon pricing was made as the must-have. So what then happened was that provinces that had subscribed to the Vancouver Declaration kicked against the Pan-Canadian Framework and subsequently challenged the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act in court. Single value approaches such as the essentialization of carbon pricing are driven by single narratives. For example, putting a price on carbon must be achieved through explicit mechanisms like carbon tax and cap and trade. These narratives overlook the sentiments, experiences, and concerns that shape local resistance to transition policies. Let's talk about the second one, normative monopoly. The conventional positivistic approach to law represents the state, the government, as the sole mobilizer of individuals and individual actions. Normative monopoly overlooks the social context in which people live and assumes that behaviors are more influenced by legislation than norms derived from social relationships. That assumption forms the basis of state-centric laws. It promotes top-down regulatory approach, a top-down regulatory approach. The state creates the law, the people follow the law. Such laws often fail to acknowledge and consider the lived experiences of those being governed. John Griffith reminds us, the behavior that a legislator seeks to regulate does not take place in a normative and structural vacuum, but in a specific social context, overflowing with indigenous behavioral norms and social organization. Climate law in Canada has primarily stayed at the level of the state. This is not only in respect of the oversized role played by the federal government, but also the loud opposition of provincial governments, or some provincial governments. The picture we get is one level of government tussling with another level of government, and both levels of government purports to represent the people. This is the myth. It's a myth of representation. So decoupling the macro arguments of states from the micro arguments of people, and appreciating the limits of state-based representation is vital. So for example, the macro reasoning of a state for a climate law could be competitiveness. But the micro reasoning of a local community would be cultural sustenance or community sustenance. The failure to disaggregate macro arguments from micro arguments and engage stakeholders and right holders on the shop floor and to address local concerns constitutes a key barrier to the legitimacy of Canadian climate laws. I will go to the assumption of perfect communication. The assumption of perfect communication is that law gets to the local communities unmediated, and that the laws as made by the legislator is as understood at the local level. In fact, there is a presumption in law and there is a statement in law that ignorance of the law is not an excuse. But the truth is, understanding the law, or even finding out the intentions of the legislator, is very complex. Judges have an entire system to try to figure out the intention of the legislator, and in many cases they get it wrong. But there is this assumption that those at the local level understood the laws just as passed by the legislator. I call that the presumption of perfect communication. So take the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, for example. It's a mammoth legislation. Over 300 sections, about 4 parts in hundreds of pages. Then, as though that wasn't complicated enough, they added some regulations. How was that law perceived at the local level? It was simple. Government is making our lives more expensive. And it didn't matter that government had a rebate mechanism as part of that law. But the problem was that that law, whether before it was made or after it was made, there was no meaningful engagement with people at the local level to really explain what the law was about. People at the local level were not engaged. And that is one of the problems with the lawmaking venture in Canada. There is no requirement for public participation when laws are made in Canada. So if legislators make the law in Canada, they can or might not, at their choosing, engage with the public. But even if they did, there is a problem with laws just passed and assuming that people understood the law that has been passed. It is a problem of assuming perfect communication. So this is what I call the 3 indicia of illegitimacy. So how do we move away from this? How do we move away from this? The process of climate lawmaking must become more devolved and participatory. Acceptance of and compliance with laws are best guaranteed through meaningful and inclusive participation. The most important debates are the debates on the shop floor, not on Parliament Hill. They are the debates in the small towns and small cities, not in Halifax or Edmonton or any other provincial capital. The behavioral and cultural shift required by climate change necessitates a shop floor alignment of legislative processes. For climate change, indirect representation must incorporate elements of direct representation and deliberative democracy. Elsewhere in the world, we are seeing a response to the clarion call to address the problem of illegitimacy. So we have multiple local level climate assemblies all through Europe. England, Scotland, they've constituted climate assemblies. Scotland, in fact, has included a mandatory requirement for a citizens' assembly in its climate law. In France, after the 2018 yellow vest protest against the green energy policy of that country, the country, France, convened the French Citizens' Convention on Climate Change. But these high-level mini-publics, the citizens' assemblies, they are not enough. More importantly, what I argue is that we need what James Mansbridge, a political scientist, has referred to as deliberative systems. A dynamic, complex system of interdependent parts where the labors of decision-making are divided to reflect the factual contingencies, competing normative requirements, conflicting interests of a large swath, a large number of citizens. No singular part of a deliberative system will achieve the goals of the system, but they can complement, balance, and contribute to the overall quality of the whole. So what does this mean for climate lawmaking? At the most fundamental level, it means that the participation of individuals must be made mandatory in the legislative process. A subsidiarity approach to lawmaking, which allows for climate lawmaking and implementation to occur at the most local level, is most appropriate in the climate context. So about a month ago, my research team took preliminary steps to begin experimenting with the deliberative systems approach. What we did was to bring together a number of rights holders and stakeholders for an informal meeting in Kinuso, highlighted in yellow. And these persons came from across surrounding towns, High Prairie, Slave Lake, Swan Hills. And at first, I doubted that anybody would come, because we had this event, this meeting, we had it in the heartland of Alberta, where people are known for supposedly anti-climate sentiments. And indeed, I sent an email to many councillors in these towns, and one of the councillors sent a response to me, certainly not interested. Our partners, our local partners, posted Facebook adverts, and some of the comments we got were like, "You're climate scammers. You're pseudo-science climate terrorists." But the persons who made these deplorable comments, they were in the minority. many more people were sincerely inquisitive. Some asked us, will the dialogue, the climate dialogue, would it be a fairly open discussion? Some asked, if climate change is an emergency, why does it seem to last forever? Do emergencies last forever? At the dialogue, we had rights holders from indigenous communities. We had a number of councillors from Kinuso and surrounding towns. We had farmers. We had the owner of an oil and gas service company. We had members of NGOs, civil societies at the dialogue. So we asked people to, in 3 different groups, draw typical persons in their communities, describe the person's profile, and give the person a name. So that is Gardner Sandy. They really took it seriously and they drew well. Gardner Sandy, we have John, the Walker, a retiree, and Joe the farmer. And the reason we used personas or representative personas is to get relatively non-individualized picture of a typical person. But more importantly, it's to help participants engage freely without fear of adverse attribution. To keep engagement concrete and productive, we designed activities to tease out what are the values of the society, what do participants think bad climate policies entail, and what do they think a good climate policy for their areas would entail. So 3 quick lessons that complement those things I've spoken about the 3 indicia of illegitimacy and what to do about them. Number 1, localism ruled the room. But it did so in a way that produced nuance rather than resistance among each group's personas. None of the personas said climate change is not real. Participants didn't suggest that their personas rejected climate actions, but they pushed back against one-size-fits-all climate actions. Local also meant more to them than their geography. It encompassed their livelihood, seasonal realities, service access, and the decision-making culture of their communities. What we learned, when a policy feels local and co-owned, their personas seemed more open to the climate action. Number 2, another lesson. There was a disconnect between the values held by their personas and the values emphasized by lawmakers, whether federal or provincial. And I'll give you an example. Many of the personas emphasized respect for indigenous rights. Many of them emphasized conservation efforts, but none of the personas mentioned efficiency. Now, for those familiar with climate lawmaking, efficiency is critical to the provincial or federal lawmaker. But none of them mentioned that. So we found a disconnect between the values emphasized at the local level and the values emphasized by our lawmakers. The 3rd point, the dialogue revealed the complexity of climate change and community members' perception of it. Participants including indigenous rights holders, stakeholders from environmental organizations, and I've mentioned this before. But the differences in their opinions on what constitutes good and bad climate laws across various sectors was also evident, but they managed their differences incredibly well. None of them, the groups did not agree on the oil and gas sector, surprise, surprise, but they agreed on the need to conserve and preserve nature in response to climate change. A place-sensitive climate law for the Slave Lake region that focuses on nature-based solution might be more acceptable to the residents of the Slave Lake region than other policies. Now, these are anecdotal findings. It is not from a formal, organized study. but they are pointers to some of the things we had discussed earlier on. So, finally, there is no shortage of arguments against bottom-up legitimate laws. For one, such bottom-up laws are tough to craft, slow to develop, arguably costly, and potentially very susceptible to compromises required to resolve conflicts. But the alternative has failed. Top-down climate laws have failed. Climate legislation and litigation are essential, but we cannot legislate or litigate ourselves out of the climate crisis. The likelihood is that if Meinhard were here today, he would agree with some of the things I've shared. He would disagree with many of the things I've shared. For example, he would probably disagree with my position on carbon tax and carbon pricing. But I think he will agree with the central theses of today's presentation. Our current political and legal systems do not align with the nature and demands of climate change. I conclude with Meinhard's 2018 reflections on what he describes as decades of climate policy failure in Canada. And he noted in his characteristic straight-talking and succinct style, the lessons of the last 20 years go well beyond climate change. They demonstrate that the way we govern our society is not well suited to respond to change, to deal quickly, effectively, and fairly with challenges or take advantage of opportunities ahead. This is troubling in a world of accelerated change. If we cannot respond effectively to a crisis as serious as climate change, we need to recognize that we likely have a fundamental and systemic problem. My presentation today highlights the systemic illegitimacy of climate law. I hope that the ideas I've shared will spark impactful conversations on how to address the problem of illegitimacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Majekolagbe, for that very insightful lecture. And we had discussed me having some questions prepared for us to discuss, but in light of the time, I'm actually wondering if we should maybe start with seeing if there are any questions from our student participants. Maybe you'll take the other mic? Okay. And then, if we have time, I'll follow up with you on some of the questions that I have. So Emma's right there. Okay. So, any questions from the room to start us off? And Emma's got to run all the way. We're grateful to Emma Peckham for being here to help us out. Some mic running. Great.
I'm going to ask you a deeper question about the illegitimacy of the law. We live in a colonial place called Canada, which I think is the root of the problem. It's colonial capitalist systems that have not been respected nature since the beginning. And then if we go to Nigeria, it's also colonial creation with systems that are not respecting the lives of the indigenous people that are within the territories, whether that the territory be called Nigeria or that territory be called Canada. So my question really is about the legitimacy of colonial law, and if we are pretending that a criminal enterprise called Canada is actually legitimate. and if that is not actually the root of the problem. It's something I'm pondering about, and I'm wondering what your reflections are, both in the Canadian context and in the Nigerian context. Thank you.
Well, we've all been pondering on that for centuries, eh? What I try to do, is, it's very easy to get lost in the weeds of these very legitimate issues, but at times to very concretely deal with certain problems, it might be important to, in a sense, isolate the problem and then deal with the problem as simply as you probably can. So what's the alternative? The world is burning. Do we forget the fact that the world is burning and we latch on to this fight that we've been in for centuries? So I think the answer, and it's probably not even, it's something you've been pondering about and many of us will continue to ponder on, is most as sincerely as we can, with all the tools that we can summon, even as we deal with the issues of colonial injustice, we try to co-opt all the solutions we can get, whether that is from indigenous ways of knowing, African ways of knowing, Western ways of knowing. It's a human problem. It's a problem of all of us, white and black. We need to find a way to co-opt all our ways of knowing to deal with this problem. And meanwhile, the issues you've raised about the colonial construct, the capitalist construct, those are most very subliminal and deep issues. But at once, how do we deal with the subliminal and deep issues, but at the same time recognize that, first of all, we are all humans, and there is a human problem we've been presented. How do we bring together the strength of all humans to deal with this distinctly human problem? So I do not think it's that problem that we can engage with with a divided front. I think it is a problem that we must find a way to bring together the humanity of all humans to deal with and confront.
There is a question online, which I think I'm going to paraphrase in this way. The person online was wondering if you could speak to the need to address Canada's NDCs and provincial buy-in.
The problem of Canadian NDCs and provincial buy-in. And for those who are not familiar with NDCs, NDCs are a nationally determined contribution, basically Canada's climate commitment on the world stage. Canada has committed to, I think, 40 to 45%, but we should be increasing that now. I think we're going around 65% reduction in emissions, probably by 2040 or thereabout. But the buy-in of provinces is a political question and not a legal question. The reason for that is that in Canada, there is no requirement of provinces or for provinces to implement international treaties or international commitments under international treaties. Provinces, for example, Alberta, does not have a mandatory responsibility to also have, for example, 65% reduction by 2040 and 2045. So again, that is a political question, and then it now goes back to how do we go to each province, factoring in the unique circumstances of provinces, the capacity of provinces, the historical responsibilities of provinces. Let us find a way to, in the most fair way, allocate responsibilities, but factoring in their unique circumstances. And I can't say that enough. Time would not permit me to go into the nuances and the complexities of differentiation. But I think one of the mistakes we made in 2016 was that Canada did not approach burden sharing with a differentiation perspective or a differentiation ways of handling the issue of the distribution of climate responsibilities. But we need to co-opt it again. What does the peculiar circumstances of provinces, their capacities, their historical responsibilities, what does it mean for what their responsibilities as far as our commitment on the world stage goes? We need to figure that out.
Other questions? So there's quite a few. We'll take 1, 2, 3, and then 4 in the back.
Hi there. My question is about how you're talking about on the local level, how it could potentially be a solution. But I think it's easy to talk about that in a city like Halifax, but from what I've seen, it's very difficult. I think the agency is lost in smaller communities, towns. How do we instill that agency that towns, like smaller communities, believe that they actually have an impact?
Great question. And I gave you the example of Kinuso. When we got to Kinuso, what I started out with was that as far as these engagement or that engagement was concerned, I wasn't the know-all expert. I know a bit about climate change, but they knew more about their values, their identities, and their history. So what I went to Kinuso to learn, I went there to learn their values, their identities, and their history, and what that means for the climate change policy that will suit their values, their identities, and their history. Now, if that's the process, then agency is built into it. It's built into it because this time around, we are not starting with, does this community believe in carbon pricing, like many citizens' assembly play out, like, come comment on a specific policy. No, you're starting from the point of what are the values of the community, and that can then inform what are the best climate measures that suit the community.
I think there were two down here, 1, 2, and then 1 in the back, and then 1 in the middle again. Have I missed people on this side?
I was hoping you could speak to the feelings of hopelessness that come when we consider how climate policy feels unchangeable on an individual level.
Now that's a massive question, and I wish I could give you very clear answers, right? But let's try. Let me give you at least bits and pieces of what could deal with hopelessness. I was having a conversation today, and the question was misinformation and disinformation, and what that means for climate change and effective climate governance. And I reckon that when we hear misinformation and disinformation, we think of anti-climate activists, people pushing against climate policies. But it occurred to me, and it's occurred to me for a while now, that we have people engaged in misinformation and disinformation on both sides. We have people involved in misinformation and disinformation on the pro-climate change side, and it has been devastating. And I give you an example. In 2018, the special 1.5 degrees Celsius report was released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's the foremost scientific body on climate change. And essentially, they spelled out the projected different temperature rise level and the adverse impact of it. But how did the media cover that report? The media covered it as the world will end in 12 years. And politicians also came out and told us the world will end in 12 years. So it's now 7 years in, and people are asking, the world is not ending. the reports didn't say so. The scientists didn't say so. The politicians said so. And those pushing against climate policies now, they start with saying, you guys told us the world will end. The world is not ending. And Bill Gates, in the publication he made in advocating for let's move off climate change and focus on economic growth, what he started that video with, he had a video and he had this publication, what he started it with is the world is not ending. Essentially that. Now, how does all of this answer your question? As much as you can, get the actual reports, okay? And in the actual reports, the impacts of climate change are very consequential and devastating, but there is a world of difference between what is contained in the actual report and what informs or fuel climate hopelessness, like the world is ending, okay? And then in the report, you would also see the measures that can be taken. And perhaps you can find a place for yourself. They are very complicated reports, but for example, the IPCC assessment report has something called the summary for policymakers, which is easier to read. So again, and this applies to ChatGPT and it applies to AI generally, get past all of those, get the actual thing yourself and think through the implications instead of you going by sensational renderings of those well thought out and well researched reports. Does that help? Yeah.
In the interest of time, we have just one other question, and we have someone right in the middle here who is next in line, and I apologize to the others, but perhaps people can stick around afterwards and we can have more of a conversation. So please go ahead.
So one of the main parts of this lecture that struck me the most was kind of this like influx of backsliding with regards to climate legislation. And so like in Canada, municipalities are like an order of government that fall outside of the Constitution and in turn like are arms of the provinces. And if like local governments, like you said, are crucial in like forming and negotiating more legitimate climate policies that account for like the dramatic lifestyle changes that climate action like requires, would a constitutional like entrenchment of municipal powers maybe like increase sovereignty with regards to legislating climate action, would that be one, appropriate, and two, like productive?
Constitutional, and great question, Walton. Constitutional entrenchment of anything helps nothing, sorry. Okay? Yeah. But I think you hit a very important point there on the participation and the role of local units, what I call, or what others have called, the shop floor of social life. And don't confuse that to mean municipalities. They are not the same thing. I mean the labor unions, I mean the agricultural community, societies, the ag societies. I mean the baseball, is Blue Jays, are the Blue Jays playing today? I mean very basic units at the local level. These units at the local level are the ones that mediate the communication of laws. They are the ones that inform what members of the local units think about laws. So what we are talking about is the bottom-up building of climate laws. And why does this matter? And let's see if I can close it with this. And thanks for cueing me like I planned this. Thanks for cueing me to do this. What we are focused on here is the bottom-up building of laws. And the reason is this. Politicians find it easier to do away with laws that are not culturally entrenched. Laws that do not have roots in the culture at the lowest level. So what we are trying to build is a climate change sensitive culture, and it would be community to community, not municipality to municipality. It would be community to community, semi-autonomous bodies to semi-autonomous bodies. You wonder what that means? I mean the labor unions, I mean the ACT societies, and we need to begin to have those conversations to deepen the roots of climate consciousness. The more we deepen the rule of climate consciousness at the local level and we build up, the more it's difficult for politicians to based on experience, uproot climate laws. Politicians fear the voting public. There is a reason Daniel Smith would not say, I am anti-climate change, because at the most basic level, most people, or many people, believe in climate change. So what we are talking about, and the work we've not done, is to build from the local level, the most basic units. We need to build the root of climate change consciousness and governance from the bottom up, such that regardless what is in the Constitution, government would be afraid to use its power to change laws at will.
And on that note, thank you very much for coming and being our legacy representative.